It's a surprise opportunity for me to introduce Nick Hague, Tyler N. Hague, who's a colonel in the Air Force. Nick has a long and distinguished career. He was selected as an Air Force Fellow back in 2009, and then in 2013 he was part of the 2013 astronaut selection class and has been spending much of his time since waiting for assignment, I think. But in the early stages of that, I was fortunate enough to be part of the team that trained Nick in field geology, which is why he was pointing at me a minute ago. So he does know how to do field geology, right? Yes. Right, okay. So currently, Nick is serving as on the International Space Station Operations Branch, and as I said, waiting for assignment, eligible for assignment at this point. So please help me in giving a warm welcome to Nick Hague.
So I want to thank the Keck Institute for the opportunity to be here tonight. So I'm really thrilled to be here. Thanks to Michelle, she's been awesome in kind of supporting this and getting it together. Thanks, Kip, for the invitation to participate in the workshop. When I first got the invitation, I went home to my wife, the more reasoned, better half of the relationship, and I said, hey, they want me to go out there and they want me to participate in this telepresence workshop. And I kind of read off some of the participants, and she's like, how do you have any qualifications to contribute to any of that conversation? To which I replied, I've spent the last 3 years relearning how to use a diaper. So I'm just trying to calibrate you for this talk today. No, seriously, thinking about what I can contribute and kind of the perspective I might be able to add to the workshop, and then also provide everybody else that's here, the thing I'd like you to walk away from today is just being able to say you've got a better appreciation for what goes on inside an operator's mind when they're trying to do something. It might be an astronaut, that might be a pilot, it might be a flight controller, but what's going on inside their head as they do that, and then that might help shape some of the ways you approach problems and the solutions to the problems that we have in front of us. So the way I want to do that, I'll just first start, tell you a little bit about myself so you know where I'm coming from, and then I'd like to talk a little bit about astronaut training as it exists today, because it has evolved and it's important to understand what we're asking the people that are being selected to do, because the skill sets, the people that are going through selection right now, they're being selected. They'll probably fly in 10 years from now. They'll probably still be in the astronaut office when we're trying to execute some of the initial missions that we're talking about during this workshop. So those skill sets are what you're going to have to live with. And regardless of that, they're going to be in leadership positions that are going to influence the decisions on what we try to do. So it's important that we understand what we're priming the pump with, if you will. So let's get the ball rolling. So if this will work, I think I turned it on. So I started where most people that want to become astronauts start. I grew up in western Kansas. I could look up at the night sky and I could see this. And so ever since I was this tall, I looked up there and I thought, wow, what's out there? All the possibilities, all the unknowns. I just wanted to go and learn new stuff. So that's where my journey started. And how you actually turn that into practice is another thing. But my backgrounds that I accumulated as I was arriving at NASA, I started out in the Air Force Research Laboratory, graduate of the Air Force Academy, went to MIT for graduate school, flight control systems for launch vehicles. The Air Force has never actually made me or had me use any of that expertise for flight control systems on launch vehicles. They have a great trend of giving you a lot of education and then you tangentially apply it. But they did send me out to Air Force Research Lab, and then as a lieutenant I worked on satellite component design, worked on large flexible solar arrays, small satellites, trying to build component technologies that would enable us to do futuristic things. What would be possible 20 years from now? And it's almost 20 years from when I was a lieutenant. So what would be possible today, back then? From there, I got involved with flight test. And so that was my first dabble into operations. And I'm going to talk a little bit about operations, but that's where I figured out, hey, this astronaut thing is something that I might be really interested in doing, because I was part of a flight crew. We were up there, I was either flying in the back seat, executing real-time operations, or I was in a control room, running a control room, collecting the telemetry, and clearing operations to proceed point by point. From there, I went to the Air Force Academy and taught astronautics. And following that, for some reason, the Air Force decided to send an engineer that had been in a lab and done flight tests and been a professor for the last 2 years, 3 years. Okay, we're going to send him to Capitol Hill, and he's going to work as a staffer in the Senate. And I did that for a year, and then worked as a liaison back to Capitol Hill out of the Pentagon. So I've got a very diverse background. In the last assignment, when I was selected, I was working on is I was developing all the technologies that soldiers in the field were trying to use to sweep routes, to find improvised explosive devices, to protect our transit in theater. So that's my background, fairly diverse. If you look at it at a glance, you might go that he doesn't stay in a place long enough that anybody can actually figure out he's not as good as they think. So that's where I come from. And then I was selected as part of the class of 2013. So it's a diverse background. I would say that when people ask me what are they trying to select, the only really unifying thing that I can come up with, because you've got I've got a scientist, engineer. There's a lot of military in here. We've got Navy, Marine, Army doctor, Army helicopter pilot. I'm an Air Force flight test engineer. It's very diverse. We all come from very different backgrounds. We have different hobbies. What's the one thing that we do, or it links us all together? And it's really that we work well in teams. The interpersonal skills are a key factor in being able to work well as a crew. And so we work really well in teams. And then the other thing is that we've gone out and done something in the field. We've been in remote places, in hostile places, and we've had those experiences and proven that we can kind of handle the pressure a little bit. Those are the two things. That's all I can really come up with. So that's what they selected. And then they take that background and that experience, and then essentially NASA expects you to stop doing whatever you were doing before. I was a program manager in a program office. We don't want you to do that anymore. We want you to come be an operator. So how do they train us to be operators? Okay, so we were all selected to fly on the space station. And I can rattle through a bunch of specifications about the station. I'm sure you guys are fairly familiar with it. It's as big as a football field. It's got 6-person crew, the inside volume of a 5-bedroom home. It's been up there for over 17 years. I can't remember the exact number of days. It is enormous. It is complex. Over 100 spacewalks to put it together. I want to say it's 100 launches supporting it. It is a modern miracle that we have this up there and that it's working on a daily basis. That somebody's been living up there continuously, well over a decade. So they're training us to fly on this. Will we actually fly on this? Don't know. Will there be other opportunities to do other things? Don't know. But right now we're training on this. And so you show up the first 2 years, you're expected to go through a training program that's going to give you all the basic skills. Now, the difference now is that we're training for long duration. So we're planning on being up there 6 months. It is a different mindset than if you're trying to select crew members for a shuttle mission that's going to be up there for 2 weeks. So if I'm up there for 2 weeks, then I might have the luxury of being able to know exactly what I'm going to do for those 2 weeks. Because time is so precious, I better know exactly what I'm going to do for those 2 weeks. If I'm going up there for 6 months, I might not know what I'm going to do in month 2 or month 3, because events that happen even before I arrive will affect the manifest for the goods and the things that I'm going to need on orbit. So all of that is very fluid. So they have to train you as a generalist. Everybody gets trained on everything, so that at the end of our training program, all of us are equally eligible, equally qualified to fly. We don't specialize. what's some of the training? So one of the first things you think about is T38 training. So to go float around in space, we fly in high-performance jets. Not always easy to understand why we might do that, but if you look at it as not, this is just another analog environment that we're being put in so that we can perfect the skills of trying to make decisions under pressure in a time-critical environment where you have to live with the consequences of those decisions. And just as important is that it's a two-seat aircraft because you've got to work with your crewmate and you both have to live with those decisions. So how do you resolve things quickly on the fly? And this gives us the opportunity to practice that every time we go up. So T38, and I'll get back to the T38 because that's going to be one of my examples about how we make decisions. We get involved in space station systems. And so when you think about systems, yes, you need to understand the blueprints and how this works, how everything's connected, but the space station is 95% controlled by the ground. So I may never actually have to do anything relating to that. I have to be the hands and the eyes and the person there that can do what the ground can't do. That may be taking out the trash. That may be cleaning filters. But those are the things you need to do in order to survive. But you also need to be prepared for the contingency when you've lost communication with the ground. And so then there is a subset of those systems that we know very well and that we run through emergency procedures to help get us back to the point where we can talk to the ground. And so we've been spending a lot of time this week talking about low latency operations. And I think that Tom put it well on the first day that we've been practicing humans operating with this low latency operation on the station and in the shuttle for quite some time. So there's a lot of parallels that we can look at. We also do robotics. And so we've talked a lot about situational awareness. Everybody gets trained on robotics. And we don't have the luxury of being able to look out the window and see the robotic arm all the time. So we compensate. We compensate with cameras all over the arm. We've got cameras here and cameras there. We've got cameras all over the station. And we take all of these two-dimensional views from very different angles. And then on the fly, we expect the operator to resolve through parallax whether I'm going to hit structure or not. And then we back that up with a three-dimensional model on a computer that is there but may not be exactly right. So then it relies on the operator to make that call. So we try to do this, immersive situational awareness, but we're still having to overcome the state of the art on the station. Then we do EVA. And that's kind of the one thing that everybody thinks about is the NBL when we do EVA. So we go into one of the biggest pools in the world where they've got the middle part of the station. So you can see the truss section of the station submerged here. The station's so large that they actually have to wrap the truss around in order to get at least half of it in there. And then the solar arrays are gone and several of the habitable modules aren't there as well. But it gives us the opportunity to float in water and almost be 0G. You can make the suit neutrally buoyant for the most part by adding weights and foam, and the suit will stay there. But the one thing they can't do is make you neutrally buoyant inside the suit. So if I go upside down in the suit will stay where it's at in the water because it's neutrally buoyant, but then I'm squashed to the bottom of the suit and all the blood's rushing to my head. So you're always moving around inside the suit. So you can get close to approximating it, but you can't get it all the way. But we do lots of training in here to prepare for not a particular EVA. We don't have a design EVA where we do it 10 times and then we go execute that exact same EVA with the exact same crew. We prepare for skills. And so we practice a bunch of generic skills so that whatever EVA is thrown at us, we're able to go and on orbit, without having done it in the pool, go out the door and perform that EVA. And I'll use an example here later talking about how we prep for an EVA. We also augment this in virtual reality using a force feedback system that we call Charlotte. I've got another picture of it here, where the in the pool, because we're moving around big boxes, they've got a lot of water drag. And so on orbit, if I start something moving, it's very difficult to get it to stop because of its momentum. In the water, it's very difficult to start moving, but once I let go, it just stops immediately because of the water drag. And so to get the sensation and the muscle memory of how to handle large, massive objects that you can move with your finger, but that take a lot of force in order to overcome the momentum, we use motors connected here to a mass model. And so in virtual reality, I put on the goggles, I can see what I'm trying to maneuver, and then I can work trying to, how do I hold this pump where the handles aren't through the center of gravity, and I've got to rotate this around, and how do I generate enough torque to be able to make this back move? And then we also work crew coordination, where you have two people working on one object. And so this was the EVA that we did on October 17th to install the international docking adapter to PMA-2, so the front end of the station. And two astronauts were working a contingency case on how do we, if the arm breaks, bring the docking adapter in and mate it to the existing docking port. And so we plan for those contingencies and work that out. But we train on that as well. Then we get into all the other stuff. And there's a lot of other stuff. So we do survival training, geology training. We do field maintenance training. So they have us out at the airfield and we're fixing the jets and we're working with maintenance to try to fix the jets that we're going to go fly. We do, I'm not a scientist, but collecting samples, growing cultures. They have us working to develop basic science skills so that we can be effective eyes and ears for scientists on the ground trying to do, their life's work is based on this one experiment. Don't mess it up. They're trying to give us those skills so that we can work our ways through it. And then a not insignificant part of the training is learning Russian so that we can get to the space station, but also so that we can operate on the space station, because half of it is Russian and half of the crew is Russian. And so we need to be able to interact. And so developing those language skills is important. I had no Russian language skill. I had no second language skill before I was selected. So I guess clearly that's not a selection criteria. Okay, so that kind of sets the framework for all the different grab bag of tools that they try to give us as part of that initial training. After those first 2 years, then you're assignable. And then you sit and wait in a queue until your mission comes up. So what I've done since I graduated last July, so it's been just over a year since I graduated, I've helped support on-orbit operations as the crew support astronaut, which means I've had opportunity to go to a lot of the planning meetings where they work in real time to figure out what exactly are we going to do on the station tomorrow? What are we going to do next week? What are we going to do a couple weeks out? But we don't go much further than a month. And then it starts to get really fluid past a month, and then that's decided at a more strategic level. What are we going to do to support the things that we want to do outside of that month time frame? So I've been working in kind of the real-time operations. So what I wanted to do is use some of that experience. I've also supported EVA 37, which was done on September 1st, and I got some exposure in how we develop an EVA and kind of work through that process. So I want to talk about that. But first I wanted to talk about just, flying, because it is an analog environment. So when you look at a jet like this, you need to understand it's got really small wings, which means it's got to fly faster than most other aircraft in order to achieve enough lift to keep us going. So it outpaces most of the other traffic. The other thing you need to know is that a lot of times planes put their gas in their wings, and we've got really small wings. So we don't have a lot of gas. So from the time we start the engines, we're thinking about where I'm going to turn those engines off. The T38 holds 3,800 pounds of gas, and if I've got both engines in afterburner, each engine burns about 2,700 pounds per hour. So you can do the math, and we don't have a whole lot of minutes. So we don't stay in afterburner all that long. So the approach to that. Our approach is I want to make as few decisions airborne as I can possibly make. So it's mission planning. I call where I'm going, I find out if it's going to be a place where I can land, are they going to have gas? We require a certain length of runway, 7,000 feet. If it's any shorter than that, then it starts to become a risk issue for us being able to stop in enough time to stay on the runway because we have to land going so fast. They have to have special equipment to start us. These jets were built in the 60s, and so they require some antiquated equipment in order to get them started. We have to have an air start cart. If you don't have it, then we can't turn the engines to actually get them lit. And not many other planes out there these days require an air start cart. So we've got to do our research as to where we're going. We have to research with the weather and understand where we want to try to avoid the weather. You know, we can go high, we can go fast, we can go around, but we can't fly for that long. So we can't hold in a weather pattern waiting for something to clear out. We need to move. So all of that research is done in advance because, and you'll hear this, you know, kind of commonly thrown out there, and it doesn't matter what helmet you put on or what cockpit you get in. Everybody usually says, you know, your IQ shrinks by 50% when you get in the jet. And that's because of all that urgency, all the sensory information that you're bringing in while you're in the seat. It reduces your ability to absorb and make decisions. You're constantly consuming some of that thought in the background, trying to work through what's my risk, what's the next thing that's going to get me, what do I need to be thinking about. So when you boil it down, this drives how you make decisions when you're flying. And this is the same mantra that we use for the station, in that you start out with safety of the crew, then it's safety of the vehicle and mission success. And so I'm always thinking about safety of the crew. Are we going to be able to get to where we need to be? Or do I need to divert from that? So that's consuming a lot of bandwidth. And then at some level, I'm worried about the safety of the vehicle. And then once those are both assured, then I'm actually going to, you know, in my case, hey, I want to fly to Long Beach. If I'm going to land at Long Beach, that's my mission. But if I can't assure crew safety and the vehicle safety, then I'm turning around and going home, or I'm diverting, but I'm coming up with outs to preserve these. And so those are clearly defined goals, clearly defined priorities that are not debatable, and every air crew member knows what those are. So we have a level understanding of where we're trying to drive. And then we look at everything through risk. What's the likelihood? What's the consequence? And then how do I take things that are up here and how do I drive them down there? How do I mitigate that risk? And that starts, you know, they develop that mindset going through test pilot school. You know, we're talking about risk. How do we mitigate risk? How do we make sure that we do these very dangerous things in as safe a way as we can possibly do it? And that's the way you approach flying an aircraft. That's the way you approach spaceflight. So this is kind of the mantra that any operator, any crew member out of the astronaut office, that's how they're going to approach problems. So T38, there's lots of things to look at there. So that's the control panel from the back seat, and it's a picture of a picture, so it is ideal lighting. So you get a little bit of reflection in there. But I've got tons of buttons here to push. I've got all kinds of buttons here to push. I think the point I wanted to make is that there is all kinds of information being thrown at you. It's more than any pilot's going to digest at the same time. So then you get into this, I start to understand what information is important and when it is important. And certain things drive at certain times. So I don't necessarily care where I'm going with my moving map when I'm coming into land and I need to know, hey, what's my state vector? And do I have enough airspeed? You know, what's my attitude? Am I going to be able to land? So as I go through different phases of flight, different things are important to me. And the interface here is something that I can manipulate so that it adjusts to what I need, or I just ignore it and move on to something else. The buttons, you get into the debate about, well, should we have 3 buttons on here or 4 buttons on here? Or, you can get into a lot of human factors analysis. This is a great example of a cockpit with a lot of buttons. It gets to the point when there's too many buttons, I just memorize that if I push this button 3 times and I hit that one twice, then I'm going to end up where I need to be. And so then as I'm flying, then I take the one potato to 3 times and 2 times, and then I start doing something else. And then I look back over and it's where I want it to be. So you start to memorize sequences of buttons rather than drilling down through menus and processing what's on each page. The other thing to throw into it is this is actual lighting conditions. And so you end up getting difficulty actually seeing the screen, or you get shadows. And so you have to understand you're also wearing a dark visor, so you've got sunglasses on, so that it becomes even more difficult. And then I'm also augmenting with, I've got an iPad mini here that's got additional information. I've got my knee board. So there's a lot of stuff going on in the cockpit. And so then it becomes managing your resource, but then also managing that with your crewmate. And that whole time that you're doing that, you're running through this, okay, where are we going? What's the risk to me? Am I going to be able to get the mission done? Are we safe? And you're thinking through all this stuff, but I can't verbalize all of that to the other pilot because that would just chew up way too much time. So we don't have to say much to know that we're on the same sheet. And if I get any inkling that we're not on the same sheet of paper, then, okay, let's recage and let's understand where we're at, and now let's make a decision. And so you're constantly working that crew resource management. So that's a little bit about making really fast decisions. So then what I've heard this week a little bit is that maybe we've got more time to make some decisions. And if we're exploring on the surface of Mars, we can collect some data and then we'll send it back, and we could deal with 40-minute latency in order to process that information and then move that forward. And so something that I think is important to underscore is that when you introduce humans into the equation, time becomes a very important factor. So you may think that, well, I've only got 500 days of loiter time there, so I need to get every ounce of every day, every work day. I want to get all of that I can. Also understand that you're balancing that against everything else that needs to get done. And so something I thought would be good to look at and just talk about a little bit is the station schedule, because I've seen that come together real time, week by week for the last 9 months. The station's been up there over 17 years. It had all kinds of time. So if we have a problem, let's just wait. But when you look at it in terms from a crew perspective, there's not much time to sit around and wait. And so I'll come back to this. That's the schedule. So that's today's schedule on the station. What is up here are the 3 crew members that are up there. And then you've got all the activities from when they're sleeping to when they wake up. They have post-sleep time. And then you get pre-sleep time, and that's where they're sleeping. So they'll get their 8 hours of sleep at night. So essentially they work from the morning planning conference to the evening planning conference. And those are 10-minute conferences with the ground to try to sync up where we're going for the day. Are there any changes to the schedule? Otherwise, go. And then every other block on here, except for the gray spot, like that little sliver and that little sliver, is an activity. And then what's missing on here is the red line, because I saved the picture of it a couple days ago. So there's a red line that shows you current time, and it just keeps ticking across. And your focus is getting this done today, because anything you don't get done today has to find room in a schedule tomorrow that looks exactly like that, jam-packed. And so you get into this ripple effect. So then there's a couple ways that we deal with that. If we run into issues, if it's really important, then we will slide activities. We'll continue to work on something, and that will cause that ripple effect. If this robot session doesn't go well, they're trying to practice for capture of Cygnus. That's coming up soon. If they have trouble getting the system up and the crew didn't get the training time that they needed, that's something that needs to happen because Cygnus is going to launch. So we need to get the training in. So then maybe it runs long. But then, this fundoscope stuff, it ends up sliding or going to another day, and we wedge it in. So sometimes we'll work the issue real time, depending on how critical of an activity that is. If we're trying to repair life support, the oxygen generator shuts down or the toilet breaks, we need to fix those things, and so those will create time. Other times we may just say, hey, we're not going to continue with this activity. We're going to hold off on it. Rather than kill everything that happened after it, we're just going to wait. We're going to let the ground think about the best way to do it, and then we're going to come back and we're going to try to work on it. And that might be very analogous to the way we do rover operations on Mars right now. We come up with an issue, okay, pause, wait. We can wait till tomorrow to deal with it and then come back. So you've got a little bit of both, where you might have the luxury of time, but you might not. But I just wanted to underscore, there's lots of stuff that's going to go on. And I have to believe that if we're going to send people all the way to Mars, those 500 days, there's going to be a lot of stuff that people want to accomplish in 500 days in orbit around Mars. And so every minute will count. And the importance of efficiency in doing operations is going to be of the highest importance. So I already made the point that the ground controls 95% of the station. So a lot of major failures that happen on the station, the crew doesn't even need to respond because the ground takes care of all the system management. So we can have a power channel shut down, half the lights in the station go out, get a call up to the station, hey crew, we just saw this, no action required from your part, we're going to take care of it from the ground. And they just continue to do science, or they just continue to do the things that the ground can't do. But you have to start asking yourself the question of, what are we going to be able to do from the ground for what's even deeper in space? What are the limitations associated with that? Right now we do science from the ground. We'll turn things on and off from the ground. And they have video, real-time video streaming down from the station where scientists are looking at it saying, hey, everything's working well. Will we be able to do that type of science? That might change when we start going outside LEO. Okay. And the last thing I want to talk about real quick, and then leave us 15 minutes or so of questions, is EVA 37. So what do we do when we get into a situation where time is really important? So EVA 37, so I had the unique opportunity of being the ground IV. So the way that the architecture works is you have EV1, which was Jeff Williams, and then Kate Rubins was EV2. They're your on-orbit presence. And we don't have fancy immersive environments or overlaid environments where you can see procedures, or there's no HUD inside the EMU. You just have yourself, a cuff checklist with emergency procedures, and maybe 2 or 3 pages of notes that you might have taken. And that's what you've got to kind of guide your activity by yourself when you're in the suit, when you go out the hatch. And you're out there for 7 hours. So you're not going to memorize everything. You're going to try, but you're going to get exhausted toward the end. And you put on a helmet, so your IQ's gone down by 50%. So the way we've set up that architecture is, the way we're executing it today, is on the ground. My job is to pace them through the procedures. So I sat in that chair. So they were in these suits for 7 hours. I sat in that chair for 7 hours. And we talked about the drain on operators trying to support ops. It's exhausting, but I sat there and you can see their helmet camera displays. I looked at where they were at through soda straws, trying to figure out what's going on, talking with them on the radio, and paced them through procedures where it's not as simple as do this, this, and this, and this. Something always goes wrong. We had decision points inside the procedures where we had to decide if there was enough time to continue on or not. Constantly worried about the health of them. How's their suit operating? Do they have enough CO2 scrubbing capacity left? How's their oxygen? How's their water consumption? How's their heating, cooling? So we're worried about them the whole time, and their consumables ultimately drive, and their fatigue ultimately drive when we bring them back inside. You know, we have a contract now where we're not going to go over 6 hours and 45 minutes intentionally, unless we've got a situation where we need to respond. So we pace them through that. So how do we get to the point where we can do that real time, make all the decisions that we need in order to successfully get through a 7-hour EVA? So it starts with 4 months in advance, myself and 2 other astronauts from the office are assigned to a development team where we start developing the procedures that we're going to do. We do a series of about a half dozen to a dozen NBL runs. Some of those I'm in the suit. I did NBL runs doing these procedures as EV2 and as EV1 so that I had firsthand experience on what they were going to be asked to do. We'd go to high fidelity mock-ups. I'd see flight hardware when I could see flight hardware so that I could touch the things that we were asking them to touch. And we spent 4 months running through the nominal and then all of the likely off-nominal scenarios, doing the analysis for those off-nominal scenarios so that the decisions had essentially, all the data to make the decisions had been generated. So that on the fly, I could work with the flight director, you know, and we could have the discussions. Okay, so what are we doing next? And how do we make that call to move on to the next? And Zeb is an awesome flight director. And so Zeb and then John sitting back as the EVA, the 3 of us are the core team trying to figure out, okay, what do we need to do based on safety of the crew, safety of the vehicle, and mission success. We want to make sure they're safe. We don't want to leave the vehicle in a bad configuration so that it's crippled and has less capacity than when we started. And then we want to get our objectives done. And so it took us 4 months to generate everything we needed for 7 hours. So to do real-time ops, that you're putting people out there on the front lines in a very risky environment, there's a lot of work that goes into that. And so when we talk about EVAs on the surface of Mars, routine EVAs going over and over again, understand that there's a lot of overhead that goes into each one of those, not just deciding what you're going to do on it, but trying to figure out what your response is to all of the likely failures. So it's intense. Now, that said, they have ultimate responsibility, and autonomy has come up a couple times this week in terms of what do we allow them to decide. The crew in the suit out the door is on scene. They have the best awareness. I'm looking through a soda straw, which is a camera that's a foot away from structure. I have that. I can kind of hear their voice. They know what's going on. And so they ultimately can help make the call. Are they going to make an engineering judgment call? Probably not, unless we're asking them to do it. You know, hey, what's the setting I need to put on my torque wrench so that I can drive this bolt in? It doesn't work. They're not going to say, hey, just let me bump it up and drive it again. They're going to ask the ground's interpretation of what they should do next. But when it comes down to their safety, they do what they need to do to preserve their safety, and we're there to augment. And so there's a level of autonomy that we naturally push to them, even though they rely on us for a lot of data and support for their decision making. All right. So those are the things I wanted to throw out there. Hopefully that hits home, stimulated a few questions. We got 15 minutes for questions. If you want to bring up the lights, I just want to say thank you again for giving me the opportunity to talk with you. To the Keck Institute for having me out here. Michelle, thank you.